Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone to this new session of the Aula Mediterrània organized by the IEMed, the European Institute of the Mediterranean, and the Master in International Journalism of the Blanquerna School of Communication and International Relations at the Ramon Llull University. We have the honor to introduce Yezid Sayigh, Senior Research Fellow at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, as today's speaker, with the conference titled The Rule of the Army in Egypt 10 Years After Tahrir. Professor Sayigh is a well-known expert in the analysis of civil-military relations in the Arab states, with a PhD in war studies from King College London. He has held teaching and research positions in King College of London, the University of Cambridge, the University of Oxford, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and Harvard University. 5 years ago, Professor Sayigh published an analysis about the politics of police reform in Egypt and Tunisia, and he said, and I quote, "Democratization in Arab countries is just not going to happen without reform of the security sector, the police and the intelligence agencies and the secret police, political police. And unfortunately, although the Arab Spring provided a real opportunity for reform, that was missed." Okay, 10 years after that social outbreak, I'm not sure if we should continue talking about a revolution. We have asked Professor Sayigh to analyze the power that the military has in Egypt today under the presidency of Abdel Fattah al-Sissi, and to know to what extent is this power stronger than it was under the Mubarak regime. This session is open to general public, and after the lecture, a time for debate will be open. So we would like to invite the audience to send the questions through the question and answer section down on the right of this Zoom page. Professor Sayigh, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Montse, for the very kind introduction. I'm very grateful to the Inter-University Consortium in IEMed for the invitation. And it's a real pleasure to reconnect with the Barcelona University network. I lectured for several years at IBE during the summer course, and I miss several very good friends from that time, and at least one of them, a major email. What I'm going to do is map out what I see as the most important features of the Egyptian military's role today in politics, the economy, and in society. I'll start with what I see as the genesis of military power in Egypt. There's a long-standing debate among academics and commentators who work on Egypt, examples of Hazem Kandil, Zainab Abul-Majd, Robert Springborg, among others, about whether the military has continuously ruled Egypt since it took power in 1952 and abolished the monarchy the following year. I take the view that the Egyptian armed forces held power in the full meaning of the word only at particular times. So up to 1954 or 1956, when Jamal Abdel Nasser became president, in the period of 2011 to 2012, in other words, between the ouster of then President Hosni Mubarak and the election of his successor, President Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood. And then in 2013, when the military took direct power again, and then brought Abdel Fattah Sissi, then Minister of Defense, into the presidency. But I think that more important really is that for all this time, the military was an integral part of a wider coalition of state institutions and of bureaucratic cliques that often competed amongst each other, but that overall, this was very much a coalition held within the state sector. The military were obviously a very powerful force, but in terms of governing the country day to day, of setting economic or social policy, etc., the military were not in the forefront. So it's debatable, but I want to clarify that the military have played a very central role in shaping how government functions, how the political economy works, and also set the stage for social formation. Now, the key trends and dynamics that were formed in the 1950s, basically from the first coup d'etat of 1952 and up to the so-called socialist decrees of 1961, in my view, that the trends and dynamics that were formed then have dominated and shaped politics, social formation, political economy, and government institutions ever since. This is despite significant shifts in the formal economic policy and formal political process. So there have been very important changes, and yet in every phase, I think the manner in which principal social, economic, and political actors behave, how they function, is still shaped by this, the way in which the stage was set under Jamal Abdel Nasser. Now, what I'm going to focus on in my talk then are, as I said earlier, the three most salient features of Sissi's new order, and I use that term quite deliberately, in the political, economic, and social spheres. So turning first to the politics. Here, the salient feature is the emptying of the political arena of all competitors and challengers who could possibly impede policymaking by the president, and behind him, the military and other key state institutions. These actors have worked since 2013 to remove any potential threat from any social or political force. Let me go back in time a little bit to Hosni Mubarak's era up to 2010, the end of 2010. Until that time, especially in the last 20 years, the armed forces remained largely apolitical. They were not overtly a political actor. They upheld and supported the political regime. They would have intervened as an instrument of last resort, but they did not exercise any day-to-day role in general governance, in policy setting, etc. However, the loss of the protective umbrella that Mubarak represented for them in the 2011 revolution presented the military with unfamiliar challenges in terms of governing, something they hadn't done pretty much ever before, and certainly not for the past 50 or so years. And it left them feeling vulnerable. It was like being orphans. The father had, died or left, and suddenly the military, the armed forces were thrust into a central role, partly because they engineered or facilitated his departure at the last minute. But at that precise moment, they didn't have a clear vision of where to go. They just had a conservative instinct of trying to avoid more change than was absolutely unavoidable. Again, there's debate here. People like Holger Albrecht, Kandil again, Abul Magd and others have debated whether this was a sort of coup, whether the military deliberately used the opportunity, or whether they were simply reacting to events. For me, the key issue is that there was a transitional period when the military did not have a clear social program or economic program. They had no prepared policy program for any sphere. I think what happened was a sort of learning process in the following period, where there was repeated experimentation with constitutional arrangements and constitutional amendments. For those of you who study Egypt, you'll know that there was an initial constitutional referendum, and almost immediately after the new constitution had been approved by public vote, almost immediately after, the ruling military council then issued a new constitutional declaration, making a whole new set of amendments. So this gives you a sense, both, of course, that they were not entirely happy with what the civilian actors were pushing, but also that they themselves were unsure of what it was they wanted and how to go about it. And so we had this constant process, which by July of the same year was starting to shift in content. The military at that time commissioned Osama Ghazali Harb, a well-known liberal editor, to start drafting a new document that would set basic political principles for governing political life, which would sort of create a kind of pact between the civilian political parties who were presumably going to take government and the military. And this eventually evolved by October, November into what was known as the Selmi document, which was a set of supraconstitutional rights and powers that essentially, that the military proposed through the form of the minister Ali Selmi, but powers and rights that essentially protected the military from coming under civilian control or being accountable to any civilian authority. This was a very significant shift, and it shows how far the military had come from February, when they received presidential powers, to November, when they were starting finally to articulate a clear political goal, which was to assert their autonomy within a ruling order. They were still at that stage, it seems, ready to accept that an electoral process would bring new political actors into parliament, Majlis Shab, the People's Assembly, and into the Senate, Majlis Shura. So there was a willingness, if you like, to have a modus vivendi, an accommodation of these two key, civilian and military spheres, but in ways that the military would go from having the informal protection that Mubarak provided, where they didn't need to worry about the constitution, to feeling that they could only protect their long-term interests, whatever these were, through a formal documented process. And this is a very interesting shift. Now, in all cases, and I also want to add here, that this moment of proposing supraconstitutional powers was a presage of what was to come later. The army did finally, in the 2019 revised constitution, finally acquired the supraconstitutional powers that they'd been seeking from 8 years earlier. You could ask the question of why did it take until 2019 to gain these powers, since they were already in power since 2013, and the president after that was one of their own. And I think that speaks to the hidden dynamics of the relationship between the president, even though he's a military man, and the rest of the military who are still in uniform. We could maybe get into that later in the discussion. But for now, I just want to emphasize that the military finally have the power they sought, which is that they have the unilateral right now to intervene in politics and government if they deem, again, unilaterally, that there is a threat to the civil nature of the state and to democracy as they define it. This basically gives the armed forces carte blanche to intervene. It's a very interesting question, as I said earlier, just why they acquired this power at this time. Why not 6 years earlier? Why now? This, I think, needs to be seen against the backdrop of Sissi pushing for a constitutional amendment that allowed him to have longer terms as president and more terms as president, because the post-revolutionary constitution had limited the terms to 2, and I think it was to 6 years each. In any case, the new amendment that he wanted, that Sissi wanted, would have kept him in the presidency at least till 2034. And it seems that the military were unhappy that Sissi should give himself so much power. They wanted a chance to curb this. And I think that in exchange, they extracted from him this power and right in the constitution, which, if you look carefully, means that even the president does not have overriding authority over the armed forces. They get the unilateral right to determine when to intervene. This doesn't mean that they'll move against Sissi. It simply means, however, that there's an interesting balance that the military have sought, even with their own president. And moreover, what's interesting about this is that it's a conscious adaptation of the model followed by the Turkish armed forces in 1983, when they returned power in Turkey to a civilian government, and I mean real power, but in a revised constitution that gave the military the veto power over government policy or government formation if they felt that it threatened stability and national security and so on. And the Egyptian military have referred to this, I know, internally and sometimes in public in different ways since the 2011 revolution. And it's interesting that they finally adopted this model many years, of course, after it was abandoned and demolished in Turkey itself. Now, what is also interesting about the transition that has happened in Egypt on the political ground is that the 2013 coup d'etat not only marked a significant transition by bringing the military back into the center of the political stage, and where they are now clearly the single most important, most powerful institutional actor in Egypt. But at the same time, there has been a significant shift in the nature and the formation of the ruling regime, of the ruling political order of Egypt under the Sissi administration. And this is where I'm going to start developing the rest of my salient features. First, I'll stay with the political, but I'll come back to this key thread, this key notion of a radical, quite a radical shift in the nature of the regime when I talk about the economics and the social dimension. The Sissi administration, in my view, has done more than any predecessor to eliminate all competitors and challengers or potential challengers to its power. This means political parties, some of which have been outlawed, as the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, some of which have been marginalized, like the Wafd Party or the Social Democrats, or the sort of post-Nasserist party. Also social actors, labor unions, trade unions, professional unions, but especially, most interestingly, I think, the business class. Egypt does not have an organized, autonomous business class that represents itself, negotiates with government, has a clear political view on anything. Not that they don't have political views, they don't have preferences that they express, they do. But there is nothing like the business class of, say, Chile at the time of Salvador Allende and the Pinochet coup, and the subsequent 15 years that took us from the coup of 1973 to when finally Pinochet agreed to leave power, the military withdrew and allowed a new constitution. All of that was done in negotiation with a very powerful business class and with a powerful Christian Democratic Party that was the ally of the military. There is no such ally in Egypt today. This is very striking. It's different than, say, Franco's Spain, than Salazar's Portugal, than Turkey, where there were powerful right-wing as well as centrist and vaguely left-of-center political parties, from the Republican to the Democratic Party and others. Tansu Çiller, Turgut Özal, Bülent Ecevit, Süleyman Demirel. These big figures of Turkish politics were all powerful political civilian actors, with also powerful industrial and mercantile capitalist class behind them. None of this exists in Egypt. And this also contrasts in a very big way with the Mubarak era, in which the governing system was more broadly based. Even the Muslim Brotherhood, while still illegal, was allowed informally to run for elections. They had up to 80 or so members of parliament in I think it was the 2005 parliament, for instance. Independent labor unions in Mahalla al-Kubra, in the massive concentration of textile factories with about 500,000 workers. The April 6th movement started out there with illegal unionizing and illegal strikes. But even that was tolerated and provided the backbone of the 2011 uprising. So under Mubarak, there was a cluster of crony businessmen who were grouped around Mubarak's son Gamal in the upper echelons of the ruling National Democratic Party. They were emerging in the early 2000s as a kind of new social class in the more familiar, Latin American style or Turkish style, etc., i.e., a business class that was neoliberal, that had a clear class interest, that was pushing for change in economic policy and economic ownership, pushing back state ownership for their own benefit, of course. And the military saw this group as challenging social order and social peace and political stability. So this explains why in 2013 and afterwards, instead of rehabilitating the old Mubarak era crony businessmen, these were kept at arm's length. They were not, some of them were allowed to come back to the country after settling on some claims against them to pay back money to the state, various things like this. Some were sent to prison, some remain in exile. But overall, none of these people regained either the political influence they had nor the economic role they had before. So what all this describes is a political arena in which there are no major political allies that are independent of the regime, but allied with it, nor any major social forces, social classes, including the business class, that are allies of this regime. What that also means is that the Sissi administration lacks any genuine interlocutor, political or social, that is autonomous, that is not simply created by the regime or invented and controlled by the regime. There is no such independent interlocutor with whom the administration can negotiate new social or economic or political arrangements. If the day comes when it decides it needs partners, when it needs to hand over some of the power, when it needs to hand over responsibility for dealing with social and economic challenges, or for taking responsibility for governance failures. There's no one they can hand over to say, they're in charge, they're responsible, talk to them. So this regime, my final point on the politics, is what I would call brittle. It's fierce, it's strong, it's hard, but it has little means of absorbing a systemic shock should such a shock happen. It doesn't have the social and political reserves of a broader class alliance, if you like. I want to move now to the second key feature of this regime, and that is in the economic dimension. I produced a report at the end of 2019 called Owners of the Republic, an Anatomy of Egypt's Military Economy, which is posted on our Carnegie Middle East Center website, in which I argue that the military had a modest economic enclave until 2011 under Mubarak. There's been a lot of talk about the military controlling 25% of the economy, 40% of the economy, even 60% of the economy. I don't think any of this is correct. And I demonstrate in a lot of detail that what the military really controlled or owned up to 2011 was actually quite modest in total volume and in impact on markets or on the private sector and on any other actor, including public business sector companies. However, one of the most salient features of the Sissi era is the massive and rapid expansion in the scope and scale of the military's role in the economy and in the provision of public goods and services. The share they take of government-funded public works contracts, procurement, and construction is massive. By my calculations, at least a quarter of the total of government-funded projects of infrastructure and housing is managed by the military. It's possible that it's even more than that. The military themselves claim to employ or have employed 5 million people. This gives you a sense of the scale. But as important is that they've expanded and extended into new economic sectors that they were never a part of previously. I published a paper with the London School of Economics Middle East Center last month titled Praetorian Spearhead, in which I argued that Sissi is developing a new version of state capitalism, and that this is demonstrated through the expansion and diversion of military economic activity in 5 main sectors or 5 main ways. First is real estate development, which I'll touch on a little bit later. Second is the creation of large industrial and transport hubs. Third is the focus on rentier or extractive activities related to natural resources. So land, water, gold, black sands, which produce heavy metals and other kinds of natural resources, phosphates, and so on. Fourth is the significant shift in how the military and the state relate to the private sector. And I also will touch on this a little bit later. And then finally, fifth, the effort to increase the financial efficiency of the state while retaining as much state ownership and control of the economy as possible, and at the same time, and this is interesting, seeking private investment to help capitalize the state sector. So instead of privatizing state-owned assets and companies entirely into private hands, whether foreign or Egyptian, what the Sissi administration is trying hard to do is to say, we're offering you the chance to invest in these state-owned companies, including military companies, but in ways that ultimately really keep real control of these assets still in state hands. So it's a way of using private capital to keep these state assets afloat. Whether they're actually productive in market terms or not is another question we can debate later. So in my view, Jamal Abdel Nasser created the version 1.0 of state capitalism in 1961 with the socialist decrees, which did a lot. It transformed social relations and shifted capital formation decisively into state hands. Version 2.0 came after 1991 under Mubarak, when there were two big waves of privatization of hundreds of state-owned companies, full privatization, and in many cases, only partial privatization. The main point is that this reduced in a major way state ownership of the economy and reduced the overall share of state activity of the production of goods and services, what is known as GDP or gross domestic product. The state's share of this reduced very severely to about 30% or so, which is where it stood for the last 5 or so years. Sissi is modifying state capitalism in Egypt once again in what I call version 3.0 or 3.0 by reclaiming the state's centrality for setting the parameters, the guidelines for decision-making by all economic actors. So the state says, look, we don't own the whole economy. The private sector is free to do whatever it wants. It owns 75% of the production of goods and services, generates 75% of the jobs. We're all for this. We believe in the free market. But what he's doing is reasserting that the state actually dictates the key regulatory frameworks, as well as law, which of course is its duty to do. But what is hidden is that the state still determines what the private sector does indirectly or directly through other forms of controls of market access, of licensing, of selling and or leasing land for private use or not, or withholding it, and many other devices, including, of course, customs tariffs, but also non-tariff barriers to trade, which in Egypt's case are either the highest or the second highest frequency, i.e. of use of non-tariff barriers in the whole world. So in other words, the state still maintains what is a highly protected economy and therefore not very globalized, not well integrated into global value chains, behind the talk of free market economics. So what I want to end with is one key feature, and this is that although major public spending lies at the heart of state capitalism 3.0 under Sissi, as it did under Nasser with semi-socialism, Arab socialism as it was called, a big difference is that Sissi's version of state capitalism uses real estate and construction as its main driver, whereas Nasser used heavy industry, and issuing government bonds under Sissi again, government bonds as a main source of foreign capital, rather than investing in manufacturing and associated spending on industrial base and technology acquisition, although there's a lot of rhetoric about localizing technology in Egypt. Everyone now says everything they do, every government contract is supposedly serving the goal of localizing tawteen, technology in Egypt. But the fact is that none of the actual policies and contracts actually do that. So behind the rhetoric, the real focus is on real estate and attracting money into Egypt. And that usually means offering high return on bonds in the stock market or in government bonds and so on, which means that Egypt attracts a lot of hot money, but that money, of course, may run away just as easily. And we saw that happen in the past year. So the best indicator, I think, or one of the most revealing indicators of what's really going on in what is supposed to be a free market economy, is that the private sector's share of overall investment is only somewhere between 6 and a maximum of 9% of GDP. That is lower than it was under Nasser's socialism in the 1960s. How do we explain that the private sector in today's Egypt accounts for less capital investment today than it did under supposedly socialism and nationalization of the entire economy? So let me move to the third and final main feature of what distinguishes this administration in Egypt from all its predecessors. And this is what you might think of as upward social aspiration or a new social alliance. What the Sissi administration is doing, whether this is part of a grand design, a conscious vision, or simply that it works with bits and pieces, it knows it needs cash. So it does anything it can think of to generate cash and bring cash into the state treasury. It knows that, well, it looks like, in Dubai or in Saudi Arabia, the quickest way of generating big amounts of cash is you invest in luxury cities and luxury compounds. So that's what they're doing. Whether that reflects a conscious upper middle class dream or aspiration of living in a fantasy steel and glass luxury compound, walled off from the rest of the world and from the poor and the masses and so on. What they see in Dubai is something they want to do in Egypt, in Alexandria or Al-Mansura, Al-Alamein, Al-Galala, etc. Whether this is a conscious class ambition or a de facto consequence of a rather more muddled set of social, political, and financial and security imperatives, we can debate. But what I want to describe is the following: that at the heart of state capitalism 3.0, or at least as an unintended consequence, at a minimum, is that this new version of state capitalism, that this Sissi administration serves and rests on a different social and institutional alliance than Mubarak did, or Sadat did, or even Nasser did. Nasser created a large, small landowning peasant class or farming class. So he turned poor peasants or landless peasants into small landowners. He created a large urban-based working class by investing heavily in industry. He tried to create a large urban capitalist class by transferring capital from large landowning families into urban mercantile and industrial capitalist families. A lot of that failed, but the social transformation was enduring. Sissi is not empowering the poor, he's not empowering the peasants, he's not empowering the working class, quite the contrary. And I'll come in a few moments to some of the statistics on this. So state capitalism version 3.0 is very far from being a simple reversion to the model that Nasser built. This is no, for people who have Nasser nostalgia inside Egypt and outside Egypt, Sissi is not a new Nasser at all. Nasser, as I said, pursued a path that redistributed wealth and transformed social relations. He also created a large new middle class through state-funded industrialization, as I mentioned, universal free education, with a massive expansion in the enrollment in universities and the guarantee of a state sector job for all university graduates. This is good, this is bad, is another debate. Universal free healthcare and employment, as I just said. The Sissi era, in contrast, whatever its rhetoric, is marked by regressive fiscal policies and a resultant sharp widening of income inequality or income disparity. And this is reflected in deepening poverty, a contraction of the middle class, that same middle class upon which the regime relied for 60 years, and a concentration of wealth and privilege in the very top social tier. This is happening across the world. It's happening across the Arab region. The point is that it's happening in Egypt in ways that are accelerated, intense, and that, of course, go against the rhetoric of the regime. Just an hour or so before I started my talk to you today, there was a post on Twitter of a video being circulated by official media in Egypt of a big banner of Sissi smiling and saying how he serves the people, under which a truck is offloading free food baskets to the poor. Sissi's notion of social welfare, in other words, is a charitable donation. It's no longer a transformation of the political economy and a radical improvement in the delivery of state services and a political commitment to empowering the large class of poor. How large? According to the government's own statistics, nearly 2 years ago, 32.5% of Egyptians were at or below the poverty line, many of whom were in extreme poverty. According to the World Bank, there are something like 60 and possibly up to 70% of the population who are poor or vulnerable. And also remember, when I said poverty line, 32.5% is based on using the rate, I think it's of $1.5 or maybe $2 per day per person. If you use a measure of, and I'll dig it up here, of, I think it is $5.5 a day, then the number of people in or on the threshold of poverty jumps to well over 60%. And of course, that is a more realistic measure. These are massive numbers. And what they also show is that the middle class is shrinking. The middle class, which is heavily based on employment in the state sector, which was the durable, reliable political constituency of the regime for 60 or so years, or nearly 70 years now, is being squeezed. The share of the wages bill, the public sector wages bill from the economy, has shrunk under Sissi to a historic low. The IMF and economists may say this is necessary and good. I'm not getting into that argument. I'm simply pointing out that it is the most important political constituency of the regime that is bearing the brunt of the policies of the regime. Now, if the government was saving money in this area in order then to redistribute or to stimulate economic growth in other areas by increasing productivity, domestic investment, domestic savings, domestic surplus, then you'd say, well, that's a winnable formula. The fact is, none of those things are increasing. And so behind the talk about macroeconomic success of Egypt achieving good rates of economic growth, even despite the COVID pandemic, that's admirable. But behind the big figures at the macro level is an economy where almost all 75% of foreign direct investment, according to the latest figures from the World Bank, show that 75% of FDI, foreign direct investment, is going specifically into the energy sector, in which maybe 30,000 or 50,000 Egyptians work. So 99% of the economy, or those parts of the economy where 99% of the population work, receive much less than 25% of investment, of foreign investment. And as I said earlier, almost no domestic private investment. Much of the remaining amount is going into real estate, telecommunications. Industry, nothing. Agriculture, minimal. Services, tourism, minimal. This is an economy in trouble in the real world. But of course, we get the rhetoric. And as long as the world knows that the Sissi administration is going to be kept afloat by allies in the Gulf or in the IMF, Western governments in the EU, as long as there's a political commitment to the survival of Egypt and the Egyptian administration for whatever reason, good or bad, investors know, speculators know that they can invest safely in Egypt or buy bonds safely in Egypt because they're not going to lose. Egyptian foreign debt and domestic debt have gone back to record levels. So far, this is sustainable, as long as these external actors keep pumping new money into Egypt. Gulf monarchies put approximately $25 billion of cash or assistance or credit or oil assistance into Egypt in the first year and a half after the military coup d'etat in 2013. The IMF put 12 billion between 2016 and 2019. And the IMF gave another 8 billion or in loans, etc., just last year. The moment the flow of capital on this scale slows or drops, Egypt is going to be in very serious trouble, because the government has failed to use this opportunity to invigorate the rest of the economy. Almost all the extra investment has gone into high class or at best upper middle class housing, some so-called social housing. But if you look at the numbers, you see that there's been massive investment in probably some of the wrong areas. And an example of this is the new administrative capital of Egypt, which is expected to cost $58 billion by the time its phase one is finished in about a year or two. $58 billion to create a walled compound where senior officials and foreign diplomats can move behind a big wall with, of course, security guard and fully 24/7 digital surveillance and so on. Was this really the most important investment to invigorate productivity in Egypt? I think not. The prime minister has said that after having built 24 so-called desert cities in the past 30 years or so, the government is now building 22 out of a planned 30 new cities, including so-called smart cities that are these glass, steel, luxury compounds, to try and absorb 30 million Egyptians. Now, there's a real housing problem in Egypt, but the first 24 cities built absorbed less than 3.8% of the annual increase that they need to absorb of Egypt's population. So there's massive investment in housing that is not solving the housing problem, or the crowding in the Nile Delta, or the loss of agricultural land in the Nile Delta, and so on. So there are key policy decisions here that are highly questionable, and we have to ask again, who is the target audience for all this? As long as the investment, the foreign money comes in, this whole pyramid is sustained. If that foreign funding starts to slow down, the pyramid starts to collapse. So this takes me then to my conclusion. Egypt faces massive social and economic challenges, 28% or so illiteracy in the 21st century. The poverty rates I mentioned. Of course, the COVID pandemic could compound the problem, not necessarily because of the disease's impacts inside the country, which overall, despite I think a lot of fake information from the government or limited information, let's call it, has certainly done better than many other countries in dealing with the effects domestically. But Egypt doesn't control the rest of the world. The overall volume of trade and of demand, of shipping through the Suez Canal, of remittances from Egyptian workers abroad back into Egypt, all these different things are affected by events in the outside world that are beyond Egypt's control. So Egypt may be hit hard by the true long-term effects of the COVID pandemic. All this makes broader participation in national decision-making crucial, whether in the management of the economy or of public finances, in supporting markets, developing the public and private sector, or in social development. But to do that today in Egypt means political transition. And as I argued earlier, this regime has been spectacularly successful at eliminating not only competitors, but also allies. So my fear is that the Sissi administration and the armed forces have put themselves in a very difficult position, where if they need others to take part in this whole process and deal with the challenges, they don't know who to turn to. Therefore, if there is to be peaceful political transition in Egypt, I think that this can only happen if the armed forces themselves see the need for this and initiate it and accept that this means a reduction of their autonomy. They're working out a new deal with the civilians, let's say, as happened in Turkey, and that they are going to have to shift the governing formula. There are many examples around the world I'd be happy to talk about. One that I'll close on is in Pakistan, which is often mentioned as an analogy or comparison to Egypt because of the power of the military, because of its extensive business interests in farming, in land ownership, in industry, and in services, and so on. The big difference in Pakistan, again, is that there is a large and vocal private sector and business class, including large businesses, that know what they want, know what they don't want, and that lobby for it. That does not happen in Egypt. So on every score, this administration in Egypt has put Egypt in a very scary situation of removing the political, social, and even the economic reserves that it needs to face the future. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have quite a lot of questions up to now. Some of them, 3 of them, in fact, are focused on the economical situation, and one is more focused on the army, on the army support with the president. If you don't mind, I will give you the economical questions together, and then we can go to the analysis of the army situation. The questions are: the first, if the Gulf monarchies supporting Sissi the Gulf monarchies supporting Sissi for their own security, or they have other interest, because since 2013, we're seeing a new era in Egypt and Gulf relations. The second one is, does Sissi have the ability to meaningfully reform Egypt's economy and making it self-sufficient? And the last one is, how much weight do you put on Gulf support at current levels in comparison to where we were when Sissi first came to power in 2013 or 14? Do you see or expect economic investment to wane as we see a political divergence? And how has the United Arab Emirates changed in recent years, and how has that affected this state capital 3.0 as you referred to? If you don't mind to focus on these first 3 questions, and then we'll go on to the politics.
Those sounded to me like 5 or 6 questions, but I'll tackle 3 of them. I guess that cover the rest. So first, Gulf-Egypt relations. In 2013, this was only 2 years after the Arab Spring, the Gulf monarchies from the first moment were terrified by the Arab Spring. I mean, I'm generalizing, this is not necessarily accurate or true of every Gulf monarchy, but certainly the Saudis were deeply troubled and worried about the Arab Spring, were deeply hostile to it, and made that very clear. We know that both Qatar and the Emirates, along with the Saudis, all supported the Syrian opposition. So in a sense, you could argue that they weren't necessarily hostile to the change and to the Arab Spring everywhere. It depended on the specific context. But in Egypt, over the next 2 years, what evolved is that as the Emirates started to get really worried about the challenge, and especially from the Muslim Brotherhood, which it saw as becoming really powerful, and it was partly worried by this also, because due to the historic rivalry, let's say, between the Emirates and Qatar, the Emirates perceived the Muslim Brotherhood as being much closer to the Qatari ruling family and the political order of Qatar. They're all, Sunni Muslims. They're all Wahhabi as well, but they're quite different in how they interpret that in terms of practice and also in terms of political rule. And so the backdrop of Emirati fear of the Muslim Brotherhood domestically was part of how they viewed Qatar in particular, and ultimately behind it also Turkey. So in their minds, anywhere the Muslim Brotherhood were advancing, Libya, Egypt, Yemen through the Islah Party, and also in Syria, as well as even in Qatar, in their view, they were determined to fight it far more proactively. So their support for Egypt came very much from that position. The Saudis were not quite as militant in fighting the Muslim Brotherhood. And we've seen in the past few years how they and the Emiratis have diverged in Yemen, where the Saudis now informally or more discreetly support the Islah Party, which is not purely Muslim Brotherhood, but seen as sort of brotherhood, whereas the Emiratis are still very hostile. And everything that the Emiratis have done in Libya is all about confronting what they see as the Muslim Brotherhood factions in Tripoli. So a lot of Saudi and Emirati behavior in Egypt has been about pushing back the revolutionary tide, whether it's pushing back the Brotherhood or pushing back revolution generally, maintaining the existing ruling order, etc. It's curious, as I said, that they would confront the existing ruling order in Syria, but then seek to defend it in Egypt. What might also be interesting, I think, for you to think about is their policy today in Sudan. Ever since the Sudan Popular Movement removed Omar al-Bashir in 2019, the Emiratis and the Saudis were quick to try and support the people they regard as closest and most dependable politically and ideologically, specifically Hemedti, the vice president of the new Sovereignty Council in Sudan, who's the head of the Rapid Support Force, basically seen as one of the more brutal and violent militias that repress the protest, that is corrupt, that's involved in the economy and so on. And that is the one force in Sudan that is sending troops to Yemen to fight on the Saudi Emirati coalition side. So there too, these two Gulf monarchies are playing very much a similar role in supporting the more conservative, the more regressive, socially and politically reactionary force in Sudan. Now, their support has dwindled in recent years, partly because of the pressure on oil prices and on their own economies. The same things that are pushing Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to embark on a radical reform of the Saudi economy. The fact that he also launched the war in Yemen, which has cost Saudi Arabia hundreds of billions of dollars, along with the Emiratis as well, of course. He's looking to reduce his spending elsewhere. And so both Emiratis, who are actually very good businessmen, and the Saudis have been reducing their, so to speak, free political assistance to the Sissi administration and have become more conditional, saying we will offer you significant amounts of money for specific infrastructure or housing or other projects, but we expect to see feasibility studies. We want the military to run these projects because we trust them not to waste money, not to be corrupt, and to deliver punctually. Now, whether all that is true about the military is another debate, and I looked into that in my report in 2019 on the military economy. But the point is that the Emiratis have gone back to where they were in the 1970s with Sadat, saying, we're not going to keep giving you money for free. We expect to see commercial return as well as economic return in terms of economic development and political rewards. Now, that sort of ties into the other question about, can Sissi actually reform the economy and make it self-sufficient? I don't think the question really is self-sufficient, because no economy in the world is self-sufficient if we're going to be very narrow and pedantic about that. Whether it can be self-reliant, let's say, can it produce, or put it differently, can it produce enough surplus domestic wealth to start replacing its dependency on foreign capital inflows for investment? So far, foreign investment far outweighs the domestic investment. The government is replacing this by very heavy borrowing, both domestic and foreign. And as I said earlier, this is only manageable as long as there's still the inflow of money from Egyptian expatriate remittances, tourism, which brings in hard currency, but right now, of course, is not, political money from allies and supporters and so on, including the IMF, if you refer to be honest, the Gulf and elsewhere, and hot money, basically saying, we'll give you 13% return if you buy our government bonds. Who's going to say no to that? If the Lebanese government says to you, but we're offering 13% if you buy our bonds, you wouldn't go there because you know that the Lebanese pyramid scheme has collapsed. It's the same scheme in Egypt. The difference is, we all know that it won't collapse right now, and probably not for years in Egypt, for the simple reason that the IMF, the US government, the EU, and the Gulf monarchies will not let Egypt collapse. And that means right now that they are stuck endlessly financing whatever the Sissi administration decides to spend its money on. That's the bottom line. And I'm not seeing the kinds of shifts in policy or in investment that point to not simply the likelihood of improving productivity in Egypt in ways that would really transform the economy. I don't even see an awareness of what it takes to make an economy more productive. I don't think the solution is necessarily reviving heavy industry. But right now, this government, this administration talks day and night about replacing imports, saving hard currency, and producing Egyptian. This is the talk of the 1950s. This is called import substituting industrialization, because they talk about it in relation to industry, about manufacturing Egyptian goods in all fields to replace imports. And they talk about importing technology in all their deals with foreign companies with the goal of increasing local content. This rhetoric we've seen before. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not necessarily hostile to it. But in order for this to work the way it failed in the 1950s and 1960s, and why Turkey, South Korea, Taiwan, and many other countries, Brazil, Chile, and others abandoned it, rightly or wrongly, why it's not working in Egypt and hasn't worked since Nasser introduced it in 1961 or even before, is that there has been a failure to invest in research and development, without which you don't get real technology transfer. There is a failure to involve other actors outside of state bureaucrats in decision-making. And in this case, we're talking about the private sector. Like it or dislike it, the private sector is important in Egypt, and it has the most access to international sources of credit and technology, know-how, and markets, etc. They are not involved in shaping policy. Instead, the military has invested in, say, the cement and steel sectors, which were controlled and owned by the private sector until a few years ago, almost 100%. The military went overnight, within a few years, from owning almost 0% in these two sectors to owning about a quarter. That's a massive shift. And it's driven a number of private and public sector companies out of business, imposed massive losses on the remainders still in those two sectors, all of which are sectors that are very heavily protected by trade tariffs and so on. And so what is the state doing? The military is investing more and more in these sectors that are heavily oversubscribed, heavily oversupplying the market already, where there is no monopoly to break. And they're just creating more productive capacity and reducing the ability of anyone to survive in this market, including their own companies. And then what we end up is that Sissi says, oh, why don't we sell some military companies or sell some shares in military companies in the Egyptian stock exchange? He's been talking about that for 2.5 years. Or will now place it in the new sovereign wealth fund so as to allow the private sector to share in these wonderful things. All that means is that companies of dubious profitability are being, kept afloat, hopefully in his eyes, with private money. Is that really going to transform the Egyptian economy? Is that investing where investment is needed? Is that increasing productivity in factories or in farms or elsewhere? Just a few months ago, Sissi inaugurated a massive farming scheme run by the military. And it's interesting how he thinks. He says, don't worry that the military is going to take over agriculture. This only represents maybe 15% of total agricultural output. For the military to be responsible for 15% of agricultural output in an agrarian country like Egypt of over 100 million people, that's pretty massive. And for him to think that, 15%, that sounds small, means he doesn't understand economics and he doesn't understand the market. And he doesn't understand how smaller farmers think. What did his, I think it was public enterprise minister say soon after that? He said, let's set up a massive dairy company, because relying on thousands of small dairy producers is highly vulnerable and risky. What if they decide to stop breeding cows and producing milk? So his answer is, let's create a massive state-owned dairy company. I'm not anti-public sector. I'm not a private market, free marketeer. I'm simply saying that none of this follows a clear strategy, and none of this is about actually working out what the economy actually needs. Let's push over the last question on internal relations and dynamics to another round of questions. I'll come back to it, but I don't want to, I end up talking too much.
Okay, then the next two questions are related with the army support to the president. To what extent the Al-Sisi regime is sustainable? Is the military cohesive behind Sissi, or are there any cleavages that could break his stronghold? Is there any opposition or independent organization capable of surviving to Sissi's dissidents crackdown?
Okay, well, these all, sorry, go ahead.
There's another one.
Apology.
If we, with the new United States administration, could we expect a soft repression?
Very good. Well, it's great how those questions cluster around one core issue, which is, are there challenges? Are there cracks? Could there be where could change come? There's a lot of speculation, especially among opposition circles, about anything that shows that there's disagreement within the armed forces. I don't think we've seen anything on a scale that suggests there's any serious relationship problem between Sissi and the army or within the army. However, what's I think also very striking is that Sissi has learned from his predecessors. He, first of all, is trying to, first he rotates commanders frequently. He's placed key people in key positions who he trusts, either because they're his sons or his father-in-law, or, there are several people who've been defense minister or chief of staff or head of military intelligence or general intelligence over the 6 years or so, or is it, 7 years since he came to power, who are very closely related, he worked under in the past. So there's personal trust, his inner circle of trust. That is very noticeable. Nasser did that, of course, but Sissi is doing this exactly again. So the frequent rotations also show that he's keen to avoid having anyone remain in any one position long enough to create new networks that could, work against him. Also in this regard, what's really interesting is that he was head of military intelligence under Mubarak, and at the time of the 2011 revolution. Incidentally, this is my opportunity to say something about French President Emmanuel Macron awarding the Légion d'honneur to Sissi quite recently, something he overlooked and the whole French Me Too movement overlooked. It was Sissi who introduced virginity tests against female protesters in 2011. When he claimed that they were having their virginity checked so that no one could claim that the army had raped them or, molested them. This is the man who was given the Légion d'honneur in France. I find this astonishing. But here the point that's more relevant is that as head of military intelligence, he knew all the secrets. He has information about everyone in the country, including all the officers. So he's got lots of levers of control, placing his sons, one in general intelligence, one in the very important, very powerful administrative monitoring authority, Hay'at al-Raqaba al-Idariya, which is an audit agency with the power of judicial arrest, which has no authority to inspect the military, but has the authority to inspect every other civilian person or entity, public or private in the country, if there's a suspicion that they have misused government funds in any way, government contracts. He uses this as a weapon to threaten opponents, keep people in line. He can shield them from investigation. He can threaten them with an investigation. Every president since Nasser has used this particular government body. So he has lots of control, which is why I believe that his regime, he personally, and this regime is durable. They will stay in power for at least a decade to come, unless there is something totally unexpected, a real black swan development. All of this means, however, not that there's no dissent within the army. And I think, as I pointed out in my talk, that the constitutional amendment of 2019 that made the military autonomous of any civilian authority, I think is highly significant in this specific context. There are those in the military who clearly don't want Sissi or any future president to be able to achieve total dominance over them and to dictate whatever he wants. They want to be able to have a bit of a balance. That, I think, tells us a lot about the internal balance within the ruling regime and within the military. This does not mean that there are deep cracks, but it does show that there are distinct sort of visions of where interests lie. I don't think the army has a united view on anything. not a social view, not an economic ideology. And in this respect, it's different than the Turkish army. The Turkish army grew up with the Kemalist tradition and everything that came afterwards under İnönü and subsequent presidents, who believed in the creation of a state-based capitalist road to development based on industrialization and big industrial conglomerates. The same happened incidentally in South Korea. You could say maybe even in Japan post-war. In Egypt, the army doesn't have that kind of vision that it says, Egypt's path to development is through X, Y, Z. Nasser tried to introduce that with socialist decrees, but we have moved into something that's neither the one nor the other. And the army today doesn't have that vision. Sissi doesn't have the vision. What they have is a vision of holding on to the existing order and of generating cash through any possible means. And here is the last item I want to mention in terms of Sissi's relationship with the military, is that in the past 7 years or so, Sissi has awarded many powers to different economic agencies of the military. The Army's Land Management Agency, the Army's National Service Projects Organization, the Engineering Authority, etc. There's a number of different agencies of the military who've been given the right to establish commercial companies jointly, if they want, with Egyptian or foreign companies to compete in open civilian markets. The fact that he's allowing pretty much any military agency or internal security and police agency under the Ministry of Interior the right to open up commercial companies is extraordinary, because of course he's allowing the state to compete directly with the private sector in all of the economy potentially. And that's happening now in the startup domain, in telecommunications and in other areas. But what this also tells us is he's got a lot of people to satisfy. He's the most powerful individual in Egypt, but he's also hostage to his coalition partners. He needs to keep them all happy. And this doesn't mean just keeping the military as a whole happy. It's clear that there are different bits of the military who want to be happy as well. And he's basically expanding the number of people either in active service or who have retired from the military and moved into the position of being governor or assistant governor or whatever of the massive local government bureaucracy of Egypt, which is huge and entirely appointed top down. It's not an elected system. All of these contain thousands of retired officers at the rank of major general. I mean, we're not even talking about lower ranks, thousands, all of whom want a piece of the pie. So Sissi's system is recreating something that we saw under Nasser in his competition with Abdul Hakim Amr, for those of you who know Egyptian history, where Amr was the sort of Sheikh Qabila, the tribal chief of the army, who gave officers ambassadorships, dealerships. The war in Yemen allowed them to start doing import-export business. These were people serving in the army. And this is partly why the army was so unprepared for the Israeli attack in 1967. Sissi is doing this, but balancing it by saying, I'm buying arms from Russia, Germany, France, Italy, in huge amounts. I'm building massive new bases, the largest naval base in the Middle East, the largest this, the biggest that. To sort of try also and appease the senior officer corps, saying, no, I haven't forgotten that you are a fighting force. You need to have all the equipment. Whether everything they buy is really needed, that's another debate. So I don't think there are going to be cracks that change this existing system anymore unless they come from within the army. As I said, I don't think there's much evidence that that is imminent. The army right now is feeding. They're being given the opportunity at the senior officer level to get into every pie. The Biden administration is signaling a distance, that they won't give carte blanche support to the Sissi administration the way Trump did, and that human rights will be raised. Whether that goes as far as putting the Egyptian administration under serious pressure or not, I am doubtful. Every US administration since Jimmy Carter has always backed off serious pressure. Not only that, when the World Bank in its negotiations with Egyptian ministers on any specific important policy issue have started to make headway and put real pressure on their Egyptian counterparts and made them, start to accept reforms, privately, the American administration of the day has gone back behind the back of the IMF or the World Bank, more importantly in these cases, to tell them lay off. And if for anyone who wants to really look at the history of this, there's a fantastic book that came out in 2018, so very recent, by Khalid Ikram, who was then the head of the Egypt department of the World Bank for years, involved in many of these negotiations. And he tells a wonderful, revealing analysis of just how all this functions. So Biden, I think, will put some pressure, enough maybe to keep his Congress happy. I don't think he has any real reason or interest in taking this as far as it needs to put real pressure on the Sissi administration. What Sissi will do is what the Saudis did just yesterday by releasing one activist who's very famous, in this case, Llull, and you know, Sissi will release one or two Egyptian Americans who he's detained or whose families he's detained or his police have detained. And sort of say, see, you know, we're doing what you want. The fact that there's another 40,000 people in detention with, you know, hundreds being tried in a single trial, facing the death sentence, 500 people or 400 people being issued a death sentence for one single shared crime. The horrendous abuse of the justice system. Will that change because one Egyptian American activist or his relatives have been released? I think it's great that they are. Will Biden say, well, this is just window dressing? We want more than cosmetic change? I am not optimistic.
After what you have talked about the French honor given to Al-Sisi, I don't know if this question is well, I think I can expect your answer, but I want to pose it. Where is the EU in all this story? Where are the European concerns about the human rights violations and the social depression? And the second question is, so what is your perception about how much democracy is far from being consolidated in Egypt after the death of Morsi, and the question says Mohamed Morsi, who was elected president and dismissed by Abdel Fattah Sissi. What is your perception that how much democracy is far from being consolidated in Egypt?
How much democracy? I'm sorry, democracy. Well, democracy is very far from being consolidated in Egypt. And I find it frankly deeply offensive and astonishing when I see EU leaders meeting with the Egyptian president and issuing statements that talk about Egypt's progress on the path to democracy. I mean, you know, they don't want to talk about human rights, fine. But to issue statements that are such complete hypocrisy is insanely astonishing. I mean, I just don't know how to describe it clearly. And it's terrible coming from the EU, from EU bodies and leaders, because personally, I'm a great believer in the European project. And I don't fool myself that the EU is all about pure democracy and economic democracy, let alone political democracy, and pure human rights everywhere. And we see the struggles that the EU has had with certain kinds of governments in Poland, in Hungary, you know, regression on some key provisions. You know, there are worrying trends within the European Union itself. And a lot of this, of course, is also about, you know, the European liberal economic project, which has not worked for all classes in society across Europe. And we see the result is, you know, rising right-wing response, populism, etc. And this is partly the consequence of a certain interpretation of the EU project. So I'm trying to say that I'm a believer and a supporter, not of everything, but of that. And therefore, I deeply find it deeply offensive and tragic as someone I regard myself as part of this project and a supporter of it, to hear people coming from the EU talking about Egypt in this way. I understand that, you know, when the Italian government has massive interests in the energy sector, in manufacturing, in Egypt, and in defense sales, in selling arms to Egypt, billions upon billions of dollars at stake. I realize that it's a very hard choice to say, well, we're going to suspend all this until Egypt comes clean on the brutal torture and murder of the Italian student Giulio Regeni in Egypt, several, 5 years ago. And the fact that the Italian prosecutors finally have come out and said, we are accusing 4 or 5 specific named Egyptian security officers of this crime. And Egypt can just say, we have no evidence, we're closing the investigation. And then to turn around and talk about the wonderful ties with Egypt and the path to democracy is just, extraordinary. Now, behind all this lies a lurking fear, I believe, in the EU. Any time I have met with EU officials at embassy level, at headquarter level, let's say in Brussels, desk officers, and some senior officials, when you talk to them, people who follow Egypt, they are really worried. They know that the Egyptian economic model is not a sustainable one, and they're really worried about where it's heading. They look at the social indicators, they worry, they are scared. But when you say so, supporting this model, allowing it to continue is not viable, is not sensible. I'm not saying punish the Egyptian administration. I'm not saying huge punitive sanctions, any more than maybe I'm saying, impose official sanctions on Israel for a continued occupation of Palestine, of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. But that doesn't mean to do nothing. That doesn't mean to cede entirely to the US for leadership, or in the case of Egypt, to Russia and China, who have no problems investing in Egypt because they know that the government will always protect them politically and protect their investors. So the EU really needs to wake up and say, the slogan that Egypt is too big to fail, which is code for saying we can't afford to let Egypt fail, which is then code for saying we can't afford to disagree with Egypt on anything, and we're going to just have to let the Egyptian president of the day do whatever he wants. And I think, in fairness, if Mohammed Morsi had survived as president, probably the US administration and the EU would have maintained the position they took during his brief year in the presidency of saying, we may not like him or the Brotherhood, but he is the president of Egypt. We're going to deal with the president of Egypt. And they would have probably then continued dealing with him, even if they disliked what he did here and there or the other. They will always do this, in fairness. But I really wish they'd stop the truly, truly offensive rhetoric about the path to democracy, or whatever, human rights. I mean, every single possible bit of evidence points in exactly the opposite direction. I started my talk by referring to Sissi's new order. Anyone in your audience will know what the new order refers to historically. Sissi has launched programs to train youth as model leaders, model bureaucrats. He's set the military, created a military advisor to every government in the country who oversees the military education program in all schools that's meant to be rolled out, teaching Egyptians about nationalism, about the military, about love of the military, respect for the military, and discipline, and so on. These, if anyone really wants to look at history, the use of nationalism in today's Egypt is worrying, the kind of nationalism. The domination of public and private media, a large part of which has been bought out by the General Intelligence Directorate and by military intelligence, where they've bought up media production companies and broadcasting companies, all in order to totally dominate public space and public discourse. And they've tried to create platforms through which Egyptians can access Netflix or Amazon or the other, so as to centralize everything through their own hubs. The Ministry of Defense tried a few years ago to create a monopoly company owning all fiber optic cabling and other cabling for the internet in the country. Again, this gives it a monopoly also for control of all communications. This is Sissi's Egypt. Let's stop pretending. And the final thing on the Europeans is, of course, that much of the surveillance technology that Egyptian security services use against dissent or against anyone they want is purchased from European companies. I'll hand back to you, Montse.
There's a question related with this. Why do you think then the European leaders support the regime?
The EU, the big thing for the EU, the discourse, and I think the real goals and fears are, counterterrorism, although frankly, that is no longer really, really a big thing. in the US or the EU anymore. You know, we're back to big war, big state war, Russia, the Russian threat, the Chinese threat, etc. Counterterrorism is not really what it used to be. Migration across the Mediterranean is a bigger issue. And there Sissi wins brownie points for saying, I am your shield against migration. And again, just today, there was something, I forget who it was who produced it. It's there, but never mind. A member of an important non-governmental organization, a very reputable and admirable one, trying to persuade the Egyptians, I guess. The Egyptian media reported this person as saying how wonderful a job Egypt was doing in absorbing migration. Egypt doesn't need more people. It doesn't want more people. It really doesn't want migrants. But it is definitely serving well in blocking the onward flow of migrants from the rest of, you know, South Asia or South Asia, Central Asia, wherever, and sub-Saharan Africa, including Sudan and the Horn of Africa, etc., coming through Egypt, reaching Europe. Europe is focused when it comes to Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. The central and first item it worries about is migration. And as long as the counterpart governments, you know, respond on that, a lot else is forgiven. I can understand why. I can understand the domestic reasons for that. Why, you know, you know, again, I don't fault the Europeans on everything at all. And, you know, I often give the example of the US and Iraq. The United States invaded an entire country in 2003, dismantled the state, dismantled the army, dismantled all the top levels of the police force and so on, rebuilt the constitution, rebuilt the political system, and tried to rebuild the state bureaucracy. You know, with massive force, they took over the entire country, spent billions, if not trillions of dollars in the process. And they did. Ultimately, Iraq has something better than Saddam Hussein's dictatorship. There's something much more like a democracy. But it's also an enormous mess with massive corruption, massive state failure in terms of delivery of services and goods. I'm using this example to say what the EU can do in Egypt or in Lebanon, let alone Egypt, a much bigger country, through minimal amounts of aid, credit, market access, and so on. You know, I'm saying if the US failed with such massive investment in Iraq, what's the EU going to ever be able to do in a country like Egypt when the amount of investment it makes of political capital, of financial capital, of aid, development, assistance, grants, loans, if you add all of that up, it's not enough to persuade any Egyptian president of any kind, Muslim Brotherhood, a dictator, a pure democrat, no one ruling Egypt is going to change their domestic calculations and their domestic policies based on the kind of leverage that the EU has. The EU will only have real leverage, and again, I'm saying this in fairness to the EU, they will only ever have real leverage in Egypt when Egyptian leaders emerge who have, for their own reasons, worked out that they need a radical change in their political, economic, and social policies. When that day comes, then the modest amounts or big amounts of assistance, technical or whatever, that come from the outside world will make a huge difference for the Egyptians who need it. But as long as those in Egypt refuse the advice and will only take what suits them and entrenches and reinforces their domestic power, then I'm afraid that the EU hopes of some sort of reform response are totally fake. It's like dealing with Bashar al-Assad in Syria. The EU know that they can't go to Syria and say, we will give you assistance if you reform your politics, your economy, your administration. They know Bashar al-Assad will never do this genuinely, nor will Sissi. But at least the EU could nonetheless make it much more apparent that they will not sustain every policy of Sissi's, and they will question and challenge some of his investment decisions and make sure that World Bank money or IMF money does not go into maintaining certain schemes. Of course, if they help some schemes in Egypt, then effectively this frees up state money to go into other schemes, or frees up the state to direct other borrowing it takes into other schemes, fair enough. That is sort of unavoidable. But I think the EU could establish much clearer parameters, ethical, political, and economic. This is not a free market economy in the formation, and I know we're running out of time. I will say one more thing here, which is fascinating and truly important. In most other countries, we assume that somehow, sometime, somewhere, the private sector will become an important social and political force that lobbies and pushes for change. In South Korea in the early 1980s, I forget the name of the dictator they had at the time, he faced a revolution in the streets, not from the working class or the poor. It was the middle class, the white-collar professionals in ties who worked in financial firms and in mid-level management, who revolted because he'd created or helped create such a big middle class that they finally said, we now expect to govern ourselves. You get out of power and stop being a dictator. This is what happened in Chile in a different way in 1988. We love you, Augustus Pinochet, but it's time, please, for you to step aside. We Christian Democrats and big business want to run the country. In Egypt, according to the statistics we have of quite recently, published by people like Ashak Diwan and his colleagues, economists, out of 2 million non-farm enterprises in Egypt, only 20,000 are large or medium businesses. That is 1%. I'll do the arithmetic for you. 1%. 99% of the so-called private sector in Egypt consists of tiny little enterprises, a corner shop selling falafel or a dry cleaner. This is not a private sector as you understand it in Spain or in Turkey or in Indonesia or in Taiwan. South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, Brazil, Turkey, all these countries in 1950 or 1960 were at the same level of development as Egypt by economic indicators of per capita income, of productivity per capita, and so on. 60 years or 70 years later, South Korea is 600% ahead of where it was. Egypt is 112% of where it was. These are facts. And that is partly because of the private sector being totally distorted. This is an amazing structure. And so when the Europeans talk about the free market, is that a free market in Egypt? I don't think so. I'll stop there again.
I know we are in time, but if you don't mind, we have 2 last questions, if you accept it. Okay, the first is, as US always support military and economically Pakistan and Egypt, Pakistan deals with Al-Qaeda, Egypt has a conflict with Israel, so what's the deal of the US for support democracy in both countries? And the last one, which has nothing to do with this perspective, is with the 60% of people living with less than $5.5 per day and such a harsh repression of human rights, is there any kind of clandestine popular opposition trying to confront the regime? Because the situation seems perfect, for a new Tahrir. Do you see, is this situation foreseeable for you?
Thanks. Those are good questions. I love, looking comparatively. I've done a ton of work looking at the military economy, from Latin America all the way to Southeast Asia, and it's fascinating what insights you gain. The question, though, about Pakistan is not about that. The simple answer is that, the US has continued to support Pakistan, the Pakistan government, and the Pakistan military for decades, regardless of everything it did, and that the Pakistani military intelligence has done in supporting jihadists fighting in Kashmir or in Afghanistan, or hosting Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda Afghan supporters, or even, of course, allowing bin Laden to hide in Pakistan. There are deep problems and challenges within Pakistan itself over this policy. But my point simply is that, it's not a simple equation that Pakistan, has colluded with ISIS, Egypt has fought ISIS, therefore they're fundamentally different. That's simply not true. I mean, the more important fact, if you like, from at least the US perspective, of every US administration dealing with Pakistan for 60 years and everyone dealing with Egypt almost in the same period, is that bottom line, the US sees a very important geopolitical strategic interest in its investment in Pakistan and in the Pakistan military, and it sees the same in Egypt and the Egyptian military since the peace was signed with Israel in 1979. Full stop. Egypt gets away, okay, they fight ISIS, but they get away with a lot else that's problematic. They have not agreed with US policy never necessarily on everything else. And you know, Pakistan, bottom line, shows us that you can get away with a hell of a lot, even when you're doing things that the US says it doesn't want. So, you know, I mean, these are hard realities. I don't like them, but I think that's sort of the simple response. On clandestine or other kinds of opposition in Egypt, I just described the makings of totalitarianism in Egypt, not just dictatorship, you know, an authoritarian structure. People could live under Mubarak's authoritarianism without really fearing for their lives. People today who are secular, maybe even atheist, i.e. non-Muslim Brotherhood, non-Islamist, who post something on TikTok or in Twitter on, say, questioning whether the COVID death statistics are real or wrong. Doctors who are at risk and who say the Ministry of Health is not protecting us and it's not revealing all the facts, are getting taken to court and charged on terrorism charges. They are being charged as members of a secret terrorist organization trying to overthrow the state of Egypt. And the security services are using spy software sold, as I said, by European companies as well as by China, among others, to spy on everyone and to punish people who say anything they regard as out of line, not on really important issues, but even on things like public health. Look at the campaign against women activists while claiming to support, to fight against sexual harassment. Look at the campaign against gays or the whole LGBT community. Rabid behavior and rabid action, and the usual detention without, proper charges being laid, without access to lawyers, being denied family visits, the whole works. And numerous secular activists who remain in custody today, denied their basic rights, who are there simply because they posted blog posts or tweets that the regime doesn't like. Or not even the regime. I don't think Sissi sort of notices every single case. He doesn't necessarily want or order every single case. He probably didn't know that Giulia Regeni was arrested, tortured, and brutally murdered by his own security services. He probably personally didn't know. Personally, if given a choice, he probably wouldn't have wanted it. But what he couldn't afford to do was to admit that it was his own services, not only because of the damage to his relations with the outside world, but because of the damage to his relations with his own security services, whose support he needs on everything else. So he's stuck somewhere there. This is the nature of this system. But it's a system that's moving in a totalitarian direction, partly thanks to the technology that's allowed by our apps and our social media and so on. And so clandestine organization, I think, is suicidal. And lastly, the idea that, something will tip people over and they'll pour into the streets in their millions, as they did in Tahrir Square, I think is frankly rather, it's a luxury maybe some people can afford to dream of. For people living there under that's suicide. It's not going to succeed. Why? Let's go back to 2011 for the last minute of this discussion. 2011 succeeded for many reasons, but one of them was that the military were getting worried about Mubarak trying to groom his son Gamal to become president. They did not like that. They did not want that. I was hearing this from senior officers in 2008, and they were saying we would even accept Muslim Brotherhood rule as long as they came to power legally through constitutional means. That gives you a sense of how unhappy the military were becoming with Mubarak. That was one factor. But another was independent civil society, grassroots organization, such as the April 6 movement and the independent, illegal labor unions in places like Mahal al-Kubra, in the textile factories that I mentioned with 500,000 workers, where time after time, starting in 2008, these people organized and worked around the official trade unions that were basically stooges for the government. And they successfully launched strike after strike and achieved demands. What they learned was to organize. The networks were created that in 2011, when the moment suddenly did arise of mass dissatisfaction, there was an organizational backbone that could move immediately and use the new technology in ways that the regime was totally unfamiliar with to create this wonderful revolution of 2011 in Tahrir Square and in Syria and in Yemen and in Bahrain and in Libya in particular. That doesn't exist today. Revolutions don't just get born in a flash. Whether in Vietnam or in Algeria, wherever, there are years of union building, of building grassroots associations, chess clubs, sports clubs. Why do you think this regime is so hostile to football clubs? Because they were a big part of the 2011 revolution, because they provided a national organization with hundreds of thousands of members. This is why they're under deep, deep surveillance, and at least one of them has been banned. So, revolution doesn't just come like that. Where's the class base? Where's the big business class, the organized business class? It is marginalized and it is fragmented. Where is the union base? Where are the political parties? Where are the independent movements? Right now, they are all demolished or marginalized. And that, again, to go back to the EU, is one area where the EU is, pretending that, somehow Egypt will move to democracy. It'll move to democracy without any Democrats. This is a miracle of the 21st century.
Thank you very much, Professor Sayigh. I think I can honestly say that this has been a magnificent lecture. We have learned a lot. I think that also we can say that we have been left very worried about the immediate future for our neighborhood, for Egypt. But that's the way the things are. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of our audience for the questions made, and we hope to see you soon in Barcelona in a face-to-face conference. Thank you very much, Professor.
My thanks again to all of your audience and to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.